Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to my channel. I'm Kip Davis. I'm a biblical scholar and a specialist in early Judaism and the Dead Sea Scrolls. I am joined this evening by my colleague, Dr. Joshua Bowen, a Assyriologist extraordinaire from Digital Hammurabi, and we're both very excited to have on Dr. Maggie Bryson, Egyptologist, graduated from from Johns Hopkins. I think that's right. Right, Maggie? Very good. Awesome. So, hey guys, welcome. How's it going?
Good. This is always a bit intimidating for me to have Maggie on any stream with me because, as I've probably said a number of times online, anytime I went in class with Maggie, it was always like, okay, if I can just keep up with her in class, I'll be doing well. I'm not going to be able to well, keep up is, if I can just not fall too far behind where she is, I'll be good. She's my pace marker. So Maggie is on top of her game.
The pace
I don't ever recall seeing you sweat, Josh.
I hit it super well.
Wow. Well, thanks for coming and joining us this evening, Maggie. We thought it was certainly pertinent to have someone of your skill levels and expertise on to address the topic of the evening. Do you maybe want to just tell us a little bit about your background and your work and your areas of expertise?
Sure. So, as you mentioned, I have a PhD in Near Eastern Studies from Johns Hopkins University, which I was awarded in 2018. And my focus, of course, was Egyptology. And specifically, the art history of the New Kingdom is how I would kind of peg my sort of first line expertise. But I also have degrees in history and art history. And so I tend to think of all of it as kind of serving the same goal. So I think of myself first and foremost as an historian. And so art history, archaeology, they're methodologies that you can bring to bear on reconstructing history, understanding the things that we want to know about the people of the past better. But basically, New Kingdom Egypt is my thing. But, Hopkins is such an interdisciplinary program that I also had the opportunity to study Syria-Palestine archaeology. I had the opportunity to study a little bit of Sumerian and Akkadian. I don't know. Were you and I ever in a Sumerian class, Josh?
I don't know if I was, but she was incredible at Akkadian, which was, no surprise.
But so I've done enough of that, to be able to teach some very introductory. So like right now I'm teaching a class at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County on ancient Israel, which I just love because it gives me an opportunity to talk about this really important region. And of course, I usually end up coming at it from a more Egyptological perspective. But the intersection between Egypt and the broader Near East is really fascinating to me. And right now, I mean, I am, I've probably got a couple of publication projects that are in varying degrees of behind schedule, but so it's been a while since I put out any articles, but hopefully something to come in days and months. Who knows what.
Maggie, could I ask you to just talk for a brief second more about your sort of hone in on your archaeological training? Because you and I dug together at Syria, but before you got to Syria, you were in Egypt. So could you kind of talk about like your work with Betsy Bryan and well, maybe not that, but just a little bit about your archaeological training as well, because I think one of the things that people miss is when you talk about the interdisciplinary role that, or way that Hopkins taught. I mean, it really was. So you were one of the people that I always sort of look to as a jack of all trades and a master of New Kingdom Egyptology. So could you just talk about your archaeological, experience?
Sure. The first time I ever participated in an archaeological excavation, I was an undergraduate, so it's been a long time, and that was in North America. I was in Georgia, actually. But in Egypt, so I went with um, Professor Bryan's team to the Moot Temple at Karnak. I guess it was 2010 was my first season there, and basically went back, every season with her, and we, the team was in Egypt for 6 weeks, a couple of months, a year, and there were a couple of years when we went twice, and I had the opportunity to work as just kind of a general square supervisor, right? So working with our archaeological technicians to document and help understand and interpret what they were uncovering. They were, so in Egypt, typically you'll have technicians who are actually the ones there with the trowel. And so working with them, I also worked with an osteologist, a specialist in human remains. So I had, so I've looked at architecture, pottery. I'd say ceramics is my weak spot, but architecture, pottery, small finds, and human remains. So in Egypt and in Syria.
So just so that everybody understands, like that's pretty extensive archaeological experience for someone who is not formally majored in archaeology. So yeah.
Yeah, I would not call myself an archaeologist. I don't, I don't have a concession. I don't excavate every year. I'm not sort of, the theory of archaeology, the method is not something that I've studied extensively enough to call myself an archaeologist, but I have participated in archaeological digs for many years and in various capacities. And so, I was very fortunate to have that opportunity.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Well, that's great. Yeah. And maybe before we start too, just for the clarification of our audience, can you tell us? You said that you specialized in New Kingdom Egypt. Can you just give us a sense of what that is when we're talking about here?
So Egypt's New Kingdom period is, sort of broadly speaking, the end of the Hyksos period, the beginning of the 18th dynasty through the 20th dynasty. So 1550 to 1100 BCE, thereabouts.
Excellent.
And it was a period. It's the golden age, I guess, of
Right.
Of Egypt. It's this is the era of, and we say everything from Tutankhamun, Thutmose III, who's Egypt's Napoleon. It's the era, the period when Egypt had the most extensive footprint in Canaan. So.
And that's all very important and pertinent for the discussion we hope to have this evening, which is all about the relationship, I suppose, the relationship that Egypt has to the region of Canaan in this critical time, in large part because of what the biblical text has to say about what happened at the end of the Bronze Age and the beginning of the Iron Age. For those who may or may not be familiar, Josh and I did a video a couple months ago, and I think you might have even seen it, Maggie. With we did a video with our good friend Paula Gia, where we discussed the archaeological and the textual background of this critical period and what is presented in the biblical text with regards to this idea of there being an extensive conquest by the Israelites in the land of Canaan. So we thought it was really important to hear from somebody who's worked with Egyptology, somebody who's worked in the material culture, has experience in archaeology. Excuse me for a sec. Sorry about that. But to hear from someone such as yourself, in large part because of some of the pushback that we've received, in large part from Christian apologists who seem upset, challenged by pointing out the nature of what's happening in the region, what's going on in Egypt. So Josh and I had hoped to add another voice to this conversation in order to provide a strong sense of expertise and some clarity to the situation. So I don't know. Do you have anything more to say about that, Josh?
No, I'm just, as always, very excited. It's gonna be great.
I hope I don't disappoint.
Impossible.
I may be a
I
little
did
rusty, so we'll
catch
see
it.
how I do.
So we'll see how this goes. I'm very excited about it. So here's what we're going to do for the audience. We've got some clips from a live stream, which I guess is not that recent anymore. It's from about a month and a half ago now. That was on inspiring. Sorry, Michael Jones's channel, Inspiring Philosophy. I'm sure Michael is very inspiring. Uh, a live stream on his channel responding to the work that Josh and I had done, and Michael had brought on an Egyptologist to discuss a lot of the issues that we brought up in our video. So naturally, there was a good deal of discussion in that stream about Egypt, about New Kingdom Egypt, about what was going on at the time of Ramses II, especially. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at a couple of clips from this video. Josh and I have some questions for Maggie, and are hoping that Maggie can provide some a stronger discussion than what we're able to provide as to a number of the issues concerning this topic. If you're keen to stick around for a bit, Maggie, and if people in the audience have questions, I'd encourage you guys to throw those into the chat. Of course, super chat for priority so that we see them, but I'll keep my eyes on those, and we'll try and get to a bunch of those as we go through here, and then in particular at the end. But if you guys are ready, I think we just jump right into the video.
Let's do it.
Yeah. Okay. I'm just going to add that to the stage. So we're going to start here with a conversation that Michael and David Falk are having about conservative scholarship.
Well,
oh, you know what?
I mean, you got. You do have conservative.
Hold on a sec. Can everybody hear that?
Yeah.
It's good. All right. Okay.
Scholars that have sort of pushed back against this. You also have maximalist scholars, and they're not the same necessarily as conservatives. There are people who are coming into the field now that are more maximalist in sort of terms of what are the their approach to the ancient texts. Okay, you also have a cadre of Egyptologists. And Moore talks about this in her book, where you've got this group of Egyptologists that are looking at the data from a different vantage point, from a different theoretical framework, and basically saying, yeah, there might be something to this whole Exodus and conquest thing.
To that end,
all right. I think just for starters, because Dr. Falk presents this as a situation of change, I suppose, within Egyptology and the study of ancient Egypt. This idea that there's a shifting view of what's taking place with regards to the discussion of history in at the end of the Bronze Age, and in particular with regards to Egypt's controlling Canaan. I guess at the outset, I wondered, Maggie, if you, first of all, if you thought that this was an accurate characterization of the field as it stands right now, and if you have anything else to say about that.
I'm really interested I would be interested to hear what he has, what he means by a new or different methodological perspectives, because if I'm understanding him right, what he's saying is that recent years have seen a turn in Egyptology toward treating the Exodus, toward treating the events of the Hebrew Bible more broadly as historical, and to see Egyptology as a source of information that can shed light on the Hebrew Bible as a kind of work of history, fill in details anchored in time. And I'm not quite sure how that's new, in a sense, because at least as long as people have been doing archaeology in the Middle East, there have been people who have been interested in Egypt because of its connections to the Bible, the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament both. And and there are there've always been kind of conflicting currents too. I mean, ever since the Enlightenment, really, when people first started being able to sort of read the Hebrew Bible critically and talk in public, talk openly about the kind of historical criticisms that they had, there have been people who have wanted to see it as complete bunk, and there have been people who've wanted to see it as just a straight up history, right? As a reliable, blow by blow narrative of things that were happening, that if you had been standing there on the ground, you would have seen exactly, or you would have seen Moses, and snakes and locusts and frogs and blood and all those kinds of things. So I don't know, and again, like there was a time, in the middle of the 20th century even, where the Hebrew Bible and Egyptian archaeology, and to some extent Mesopotamian and Syria Palestine archaeology is, it's all we had. There wasn't a lot of, there were a lot of holes in sort of the material record that could have backed up the Hebrew Bible. And over time, we've found things that do sort of shore up some of the things about the narratives in the Hebrew Bible. I mean, even, in the middle of the 20th century, right, there was no archaeological evidence. There's no evidence outside the Hebrew Bible, really, and accounts from Hellenistic historians. There was such a person as King David, right? And there were people who thought of King David as a myth, who took sort of the opportunity to say King David is a pure myth. And, with the discovery of the Tel Dan stela in the 90s, suddenly we have evidence that people, just a couple hundred years after, even less than David is supposed to have lived, we're talking about a house of David in Judah. So, and you also have in Egyptology, so, the first person you always think of for this is Jan Assmann, who looked to the relationship between Egypt and Canaan as a source for at least the religious beliefs that grew into Israelite religion and Judaism. Because Akhenaten, I'm sure you guys know, most of your viewers probably do too, is the pharaoh who restricted Egyptian religion, who consolidated Egyptian religion into the worship effectively of one God, the sun god. And so, and again, some of the themes of Amarna literature and Amarna religious, so like the Great Hymn to the Aten famously is sort of reflected in the Psalms. So there's that, but again, that's been going on for decades. There do seem to be, and Faulk is one of these who there are some, and again, I'm trying to think, there are young historians, young Egyptologists, I guess, who are following in the footsteps of people either like Assmann, who want to talk about it from the perspective of cultural memory and the evolution of religions, and I use the word evolution loosely, but the development of religious thought, or who want to follow in the footsteps of people like Kitchen and Hofmeyr and Bitak and folks like that, who have looked for real evidence, right, real connections, like real signs that the Exodus narrative in particular reflects a real history, and that you can see in Egyptian archaeology the things that it is talking about. But again, I don't see how that's new, and I'm not aware of it. It isn't. I'm not aware of any like front of young scholars kind of flooding the field with this sort of revolutionary approach to it. It just seems to me like it's, there are people who want to follow in the footsteps of scholars who are interested in the biblical narrative and are looking for evidence for it in Egyptian archaeology.
Of course, right. So this isn't something especially new. This is just a continuation of the way things have been for a long time. If I'm hearing you correctly, do you have any idea what he's talking about here when he mentions a cadre of Egyptologists? He makes mention of a book by Moore, who talks about this cadre of Egyptologists looking from the data, looking at the data from a different vantage point and drawing conclusions about the historicity of the Exodus and the conquest. Do you have any idea what that's about?
I really am not sure. You might be able to clue me in. I know there was a volume not too many years ago that kind of gathered together, so Hoffmeyer and a couple of other people with some, sort of newer, sort of earlier career scholars to explore some of the connections between Egyptology and the Hebrew Bible narrative. But I honestly don't, to be perfectly honest. This is just not something that rings any bells with me.
Okay.
I can see there. Oh, go ahead.
No.
There's not like a roving pack of young Egyptologists at the conferences that are, taking the halls by storm. It's okay. Nothing like that.
Nothing like that.
That we know of.
I think there may be a tendency in Egyptology and in scholarship, in ancient history and ancient studies in general, for people who want to take a more literalist approach to literary sources, so like to the Hebrew Bible, or to Manetho, to Josephus, to any of these sort of not primary sources, right, but sort of primary plus one, sort of one and a half secondary sources. And there you can kind of see that, you could call yourself conservative or apologetic or something like that. And I don't know if it's just me, but people like that often seem to kind of have a sense that they're being laughed at, that they're being mocked, that they're being treated unfairly by other scholars. And in some cases, it's probably not entirely an incorrect perception. But there are also reasons for it, so which I expect we'll get to. It would be not, and because the thing is, if there was a smoking gun, if there was clear evidence for the narratives of Egypt and Israel in the Hebrew Bible, particularly, and I'm thinking here, the Exodus is always the one that comes right to the fore. If there was smoking gun evidence for the Exodus, I cannot imagine any Egyptologist not being at least open to considering it, right? I cannot imagine it not being something that people wanted to engage with. I can imagine.
There's the smoking gun.
Sorry, I had to.
That ain't smoke.
Kip, I think that's the to cock you fallacy. So,
yeah, most likely. So, yeah. So I think sorry, I feel like I interrupted you, and I thought you were finishing a point there, and I interrupted you with my very silly joke.
Well, that's the thing. Like, I don't know, the smoking gun issue. I mean, well, why don't we talk about it? Why don't we talk about the smoking gun? I mean, what is the smoking gun he's talking about?
What is it? I believe in that particular clip, it's I mean, he draws a lot of his information from features in the biblical text, like Egyptian loanwords and Egyptian names, and things of that nature. Some sketchy, loose correspondences between a handful of sites in the Levant that seem like they could potentially align with elements of the conquest narrative, but it's not the smokiest of guns.
I mean, even the Egyptian loanwords, right? Like again, the study of Semitic loanwords in Egyptian and vice versa, is an old one, right? Hoke, who wrote the book, the textbook I learned Middle Egyptian from, wrote extensively about Semitic loanwords in Egyptian, and that was, again, middle of the 20th century. It was decades ago. It's and to date, as far as I know, no one has ever, every single time, and this, I think, and this is something that I think really gets to the beauty of the biblical text. Every time you think you have a smoking gun, somebody else is going to pull out a different smoking gun, and you're going to be standing there, like you're at the OK Corral, and each of you is going to have a smoking gun, but you're going to be on opposite ends of the corral, right? Like, again, I'm
shooting blanks.
But everybody's shooting blanks. Exactly.
We're all just shooting blanks because our sources are all so light. They're all so badly affected by editorial and redactional layering. It makes
when we're not talking about redaction, even when we're not talking about things that have happened since these texts were put into writing, if we could even track that down, even if we could track it down, right? Even if we had an text, it almost seems like there's always everything that gets in there is always going to be something that you could read two ways, right?
Right. Yeah.
It's like walking into a hall of mirrors and you wonder if that's deliberate. It's like so for instance, right? Like you were talking about names, Egyptian names in the Hebrew Bible, right? The classic one is Potiphar, right? Padi Pare, the person who enslaved Joseph, right? Padi Pare, that's a perfectly good Egyptian name, but it's not it's a perfectly good name if you're in Egypt in the 19th dynasty and onward, right? Like, as far as I know, the earliest that's going to appear is the reign of Seti I. And that would seem to be a smoking gun that the biblical narrative is made up. It's invented after the fact if you're a biblical literalist, because if you're a biblical literalist, you might make the case that, well, the Exodus took place in 1450 BCE, right? Much earlier in the 18th dynasty. So before there's any attestation of names of that type, the Padi, the god, the one whom such and such a god has given. But if you are a biblical literalist who goes, well, I literally think that the Exodus must have happened in the 19th dynasty because the city of Ramses features in it, right? It depends on what literal you want to go with. You've got a smoking gun one way or the other, right? The same gun, same smoke, two completely different points that you're trying to make with it.
Well, maybe that's a good segue into the second question. So in the video that we did, I quoted from Nava Panitz-Cohen, who is an archaeologist, works in the Levant. And here was the quote: "The end of the Amarna interlude was followed by a much tightened control of Canaan by the rulers of the 19th dynasty, covering all of the 13th century BCE. This phase, Late Bronze 2B, began with the military campaigns of Seti I, 1295, and was dominated by the long-lived Ramses II, 1279 to 1212. So to that, and I guess you got the clip ready to go, this was Falk's response.
Oh, yeah. Let me just
established at strategic locations.
The dominance of Ramses II's control over the Levant is wildly overstated. It's wildly overstated. The fact is that Ramses II reigned 66 years. His last campaign was in his 18th regnal year. It also misrepresents what the function of those garrison towns were. Those garrison towns weren't there to beat down the locals. Most of them were fairly small, between 250 and 1,000 people. Now, half of that cohort would be military people, and half of that again would be chariots. So in some garrison towns, you had as few as 50 chariots. That's not enough to control a region. The three functions of the garrison towns were to collect tribute, to be a monitoring station, and to be a rest drop for the king when he goes on campaign. That's the three functions of garrison towns. They're really not there to be the stick. They're the eyes of the pharaoh, not the outstretched arm and the mighty hand.
Okay. I expect there's probably a lot there to talk about. But one of the reasons we really were interested in having you on to talk was geared in this direction of the question of control. What, the nature of Egyptian control in the region of Canaan at the end of the Bronze Age and the beginning of the Iron Age. What did this look like? And we heard Josh quote from a well-known, widely published, highly respected Levantine archaeologist who said that that Egyptian was the dominant power in the region. And then we heard Faulk challenge that with this statement that that Egyptian dominance in Canaan was, in his words, why the dominance of Ramses II's control over the Levant is wildly overstated. So I'm just very interested to hear from you, Maggie. What does this look like in the Levant? What is the extent of Ramses II's control? Sorry, in the region. What does this look like? And then maybe you could say some things too about his description of the garrison towns, their functions, and how this factored into the Egyptian presence in the Levant.
Set us straight, Maggie.
Yes, please.
Set us straight.
Well, so I'm going to start by saying that Falk is not wrong to question this sort of blanket statement that Egypt has an iron grip on Canaan throughout the Bronze Age, the late Bronze Age. And, because again, the late Bronze Age is the period when the Egyptians have put permanent military installations, or at least semi-permanent, right? So they put long-term military installations in Canaan. So the idea, right, what pops into your mind, right? What does it really mean to control an area? What does that look like on the ground? I think, so to say that, well, for starters, you give me 50 chariots and I'll do a lot of damage, particularly if my neighbors don't have them. But leaving that aside, right, I actually, in fairness to the viewers, right, Kip, you gave me this question ahead of time so that I could put together some visuals so that we could look at it. Because I think the only way to think about Egyptian control on the ground in Canaan is to look at a picture. And if you could put up the slides I sent you, I can show you a map that I just grabbed out of a book by Ellen Morris. And this is an old book. It came out in 2005. But I think most of the information in it is still pretty good. And what you're looking at there on the right, and this is, wall of text, sorry guys. What you're looking at here on the right is a map of Canaan with markers where we think the Egyptians had these garrison towns, right? These installations where there were Egyptians living and working for long, over the course of years and decades. And as you can see, they sort of are clustered in the south and closer to the coast. So on the coast and in the foothills, the sort of lowlands of the mountains. But if you look at the scale in the lower right-hand corner there, we're not talking about a huge area of land. We're talking, that scale, the whole scale bar is 40 kilometers. That's about a day's walk in even terrain, maybe a couple days in the mountains if you're, but if you know the terrain well,
I don't
you're
think I
in
could
good
do it
shape.
anymore. But
I'd be hard pressed to do it. But I think that somebody who was a professional runner, a messenger,
yeah.
who knew the terrain well and who did this kind of thing regularly probably could cover, the distance between even one of those lowland garrison towns and one of the ones higher up in the hills in a fairly short amount of time. So if you are positioning your people no more than a day's walk from one another, what you are positioning them to do is communicate. Because what is it, Faulk was saying, right, the only reason they have these garrison towns is because they want to collect tribute. Well, what could possibly be more important than collecting your money? I mean, when people owe money, right, what is the basis for so many movies, right, that involve people going to great lengths to avoid the guys with lead pipes and machine guns that are coming for their money? So the Egyptians, if they wanted tribute, had a really good reason to do everything they could to keep an eye on things. And Faulk points out, right, he said, this is not the arm of the Egyptian state, it's the eyes of the Egyptian state. But to me, that's a bit of a false dichotomy, right? Because if these garrison towns are here, if you have anywhere from a few dozen to a couple hundred Egyptians, and those Egyptians are better armed, they're well organized, they're positioned, they do have, some chariotry, they're positioned to move around and just keep an eye on things, right? They're also in a position to take captives. They're in a position to put people in prison, right? The Egyptians had jails. They're in a position to punish people with, various forms of corporal punishment, right? So that, you can keep people afraid. You can keep people in line in a lot of different ways. You don't have to be marching through up and down the streets of their village, with an AK-47 on your shoulder at all times. You don't have to to tell them when to wake up, tell them when to go to sleep, to be a big presence in people's lives and to exert, some kind of control or influence. And not all of these garrison towns were active at every point throughout, the 19th dynasty. There are times when they'll have sort of gaps in, apparently gaps in the presence of the Egyptians there. Sometimes they might be attacked. It wasn't always a friendly relationship. And the Egyptians, again, perfect control, almost certainly not. Right? We don't want to think of it as a perfectly smooth machine. But if you think about this, and again, we're thinking of them as military garrisons, right? It might even be more apropos to think of them as police stations, right? To think about this as a city where there's a lot of potential for unrest, but where you have put a police station every few blocks. People are going to try to get away with things, and they're going to get away with a lot. I live in Baltimore. There's a police station a block from my house and people still get away with stuff. But I also know that the police are there. I pay my taxes. And if something happens, those police officers, most of the time, God bless them, will go out and try to do something about it. So, and it's one of those things where I don't think it is good to overstate the directness and the intensity of Egyptian control of Canaan at any point in the New Kingdom period, in the late Bronze Age. And there's certainly places where it seems to have really waned. So like the Amarna period, Egyptian vassals are saying, we need help, send us people, send us troops, because there are raiders attacking our cities. They're taking our people away from us. They're stealing our stuff. They're undermining our authority as the leaders of these Canaanite cities. And they're asking the Egyptians for help. And the Egyptians are apparently, if we are to believe the rhetoric of their Canaanite vassals, not providing. But I think that the very fact that there's that abundant correspondence from that short period indicates there's a lot of back and forth. There's a lot of communication, if nothing else. And so the Egyptians are definitely there, and they are definitely trying to protect their interests in the region.
Can I ask a question about that? Because I wonder if this question that, or the statement that we made, the quote that we read by Ponitz Cohen, was maybe Michael and David went a different direction than maybe it was intended. So I think the reason that this comes up so frequently, and if you read any of Lester Graby's work, for example, like this is just something that he just sort of brings up. He's one of, 1,000 hyperbolic that do this, right? The problem with seeing a conquest of any significance taking place, some type of a big movement in to Canaan during the New Kingdom, is what you're talking about here. The fact that there is an Egyptian presence and there is communication. I think it's brought up, like it's strange that we know nothing of a massive influx of conquering Israelites, if there is, during the 13th century. Forget control, just presence and communication. What do you think about that?
I will say that, the Amarna letters are kind of a unicum. We don't have reams of communication about conditions in Canaan throughout most of the late Bronze Age, from the Egyptian side, certainly. And I don't think it's necessarily the case that every conflict is going to leave a written record. Like we have destruction layers throughout the Bronze Age, up and down Canaan, and no, some that people try to link with the conquest by the Israelites, and some that clearly couldn't be a part of that, right, in the early Bronze Age even, right, that we don't have a good explanation for, because they didn't leave a good enough record for us to really understand that. So I wouldn't, and again, I agree with you in the sense that it would be surprising if, but again, we have to think about what Exodus are we talking about, right? Because what you're describing to me is a large influx of people. How many, and Josh, you know this better than I do, right? How many people are supposed to have left Egypt in the Exodus?
It depends on how one interprets the text, right? So I think if you're taking the numbers in places like Exodus 12:37 seriously, the 600,000, and you're not trying to, read that as a different meaning of the Hebrew word thousand, for like a military unit or a clan, or if you're not trying to see these numbers as somehow symbolic or whatever, if you take those numbers seriously, even sort of seriously, like they're representative of a large number, that number is 600,000 fighting men.
And
It's
what's
an
the
enormous
overall
number.
population of Egypt in this period?
Yeah.
Something
Right.
like a couple million people.
Yeah.
Again,
Like,
very
3
difficult
million,
to
I think so.
estimate.
Yeah.
But I mean, even if these numbers are hyperbolic, though, I think the intention of the text certainly is to provide this sense that it is an enormous number of people who have made the flight out of Egypt and into the region of Canaan.
What would really surprise me is not so much that we don't see Egyptian records of it, is that we don't see any mention of the Egyptian garrisons in the Hebrew Bible. That to me would be the stranger thing, because there are other places in the biblical narrative where they talk about fighting with the Egyptians, or where they're very explicit. And they're not just talking about it, right? They're talking about like small, like Abimelech of Gerar, right? Like he's not Pharaoh of Egypt, but he's a character, right? Or the king of Salem, or like any number of these, or like all the alliance and the story about Abraham and Lot, right? Like all of these, there are people, right? There are personages, there are political powers in the region. And it surprises me that nobody mentions, because it's like, there were probably Egyptians living there, like even in Sinuhe, right? The story of Sinuhe from the Middle Bronze Age, right? Way back when, and we can't get into the Middle Bronze Age because that's just a whole other thing. But when Sinuhe is on the run, it seems like as soon as he clears the border, right? As soon as he clears the Delta and is off into the desert. He's free from the Egyptian authorities. But the guys he goes to visit with, right, or the guys he goes to stay with, right, the Canaanites he goes to live among are telling him, we've got Egyptians over here. Come join us. You'll be able to, you can talk to them. You'll feel like you're at home, right? There's so much, interwovenness in that period. And the thing that really surprised me is, as explicit as the Hebrew Bible tries to be, if it's really trying to cast itself as having taken place at a time when there were regular Egyptian delegations to Canaan, where there were Egyptian outposts, where there were substantial numbers of Egyptians resident, I would have thought that they would have said so in the Bible.
And this is why Finkelstein says so in that recent series that he did at the Albright School down in Jerusalem, like the Albright Institute. Is
that the Canaan series?
Yeah. You know, the Hebrew Bible knows nothing of Egypt during that transitional period. Like it just knows nothing of it. So
it knows a lot about Egyptian literature. Like if you're looking at the Exodus, one of my favorite things about it is like the river Nile turning to blood, right? That's a beautiful Egyptian literary motif that goes back, hundreds of years. Right? There's the famous story about the gods dyeing the river red to confuse the goddess Sekhmet, so that she'll think they take red beer. They fill up the entire Nile Valley with red beer because she's been sent by the sun god to kill off humankind, and they want to stop her. And so they fill the whole Nile Valley with red beer, and she goes, "Ooh, blood, oh boy," and goes and drinks it, and she gets so drunk that she passes out. In that story, a blood Nile is a good thing. In the Hebrew Bible, there is a blood Nile. It's a bad thing. It inverts
polemic now
an Egyptian literary motif. Right? Because, and again, the blood Nile is not always a good thing in Egypt, right? There are other texts, so like the pessimistic literature from the Middle Bronze Age that cast a Nile red with blood as a bad thing, a sign of the god's displeasure, but or just the world having gone awry. But there are things about, or even the story of Potiphar, right? There is a story called the Tale of the Two Brothers, where a younger brother is seduced by his older brother's wife, who then accuses him of rape. Right? There are Egyptian literary motifs that come up time and time again, and really, like if you look at it, the plagues, you can almost track them 1-to-1 to Egyptian motifs, right? So a plague of flies. Well, what is a fly for an Egyptian? Josh, do you remember? I'm sure Betsy told you.
Don't do this to me.
I won't.
I was probably sitting in class, like translating Sumerian in my head. That's probably what was happening.
I guarantee that's what you were doing, because Sumerian will forever baffle me. I will never be able to read Sumerian. But I might try taking
you and
it
Billy
with
Carson.
But anyway, a fly is a symbol of military valor. Egyptian soldiers are given flies. Right, the Queen Ahotep, right, a famous Egyptian queen who was a military leader, had golden flies, the flies of valor. Because what's a good soldier? He's somebody who constantly harries the enemy and never gives up. You can never catch him. He's always going to come back and sting you again. There's a plague of flies, right? The Egyptians are, frogs, the plague of frogs, right? What happens every year when the Nile floods? Frogs, lizards, snakes, all sorts of creepy crawlies get stirred up. But that's also the whole reason that Egypt is so bountiful, it's so fertile, is that the Nile floods and these things come up out of the earth. In fact, there is an Egyptian creation myth that involves the creepy crawlies kind of coming up out of that dark, wet darkness. So those Exodus, the plagues there is a way that you can look at them as inversions or sportive treatments of Egyptian literary motifs. So, I mean, even the Exodus, even the night itself, right? The demon that comes by, the angel that comes by, and trying to keep a death-dealing supernatural being awake from passing by your home at night. There are Egyptian spells against that, right? So it's not that the Hebrew Bible, you can make an argument that the Hebrew Bible is very familiar with Egypt, that it's richly literate in Egyptian myth and story. I think you could make that argument.
Right.
But again,
so maybe
what it's not particularly literate about is the actual situation on the ground during the reign of Ramses II, in which there probably would
Yeah.
have been, even if they were not a well-organized, highly structured governmental presence, even if they were just, 30 guys in a chariot, they would still have been there. They would still have, and you saw that map, right? There are plenty of these places where Egyptians were positioned, where they were coming and going a lot, and you would think we'd hear something about that, not necessarily from the Egyptians, but from the Israelites. So
I need to let you know, Maggie, that if you're looking for an updated map of the region, there is one out there for sale.
We will get to that. Yes. So, sorry.
All right.
Yeah.
Before I get too carried away dreaming about Egyptian literature, I'll let you keep going.
Josh teased it. We'll get there, but I think I'm happy. I'm really glad you made that point, because I think that's a glaring one that people miss, where this story about Exodus and conquest kind of leaves Pharaoh behind in Egypt and enters Canaan filled with Canaanites. Yeah, it's an excellent point that just does not really seem to align with even this perspective of Egypt that you provided for us here. One other thing that I wanted to ask about this map and about this period. You mentioned that there was perhaps some waning control of Egypt during the Amarna period. What does the situation look like by the time of Ramses II, I guess, by comparison?
So Ramses II would like you to think that he had perfect control, that the people of Canaan, all the way into Syria, right, the lands along the Orontes and the Euphrates, that his ancestors, or his forerunners, not necessarily his ancestors, but his forerunners as Pharaoh had conquered, that the Mossad period were all falling at his feet. But in fact, it was a really difficult time in Canaan for the Egyptians, because they were faced with pressure from the north in the form of the Hittite Empire. And, tribute is one thing, right? Collecting taxes, getting protection money from your Canaanite vassals is one thing. But I think something that Faulk didn't bring up, but that I think is also important, is that having contact with and a presence in the city-states of Canaan gave the Egyptians insight into what the Hittites were doing, because the Hittites are competitors for trade along the Mediterranean coast. They would love nothing more than to have ever more control, right, of those port cities, and to be able to move goods and people around, down to the Red Sea, to reach Africa, Arabia, right? Like there's a lot of reasons why the Hittites would have wanted good control of the Canaanite coast and hill country even as well. And in the reign of Ramses II, the Hittites are trying to push south, and the Egyptians are trying to keep them to the north. And so controlling, having garrisons, having a presence in Canaan was important to Ramses II for strategic, right, bigger geopolitical strategic reasons than just collecting taxes or tribute, I think. But it didn't work out necessarily the way he wanted it to, in the sense that, like, he got his tail handed to him at Kadesh, right? In Ramses II's year 5, he loses effectively a major battle at Kadesh, on the map, right? So you can sort of see Kadesh as like the border between the Egyptian and the Hittite sphere of influence. Right? Calling it an empire is again, it's probably, it depends on how you want to think about control, what you want to think about just day-to-day control looking like. Is it, like I said, is it literally a guy with a Kalashnikov on the corner of your street, or is it, more just, is it more an awareness of the potential consequences of doing certain things or not doing certain things?
See, this is the big thing that I think it's important to point out, just more generally, right? If you think about the Assyrians, particularly in the New Assyrian Empire, you think about when they're marching out to the west, or when they're trying to keep control of Babylonia in the south. There's a wide range in which one, polity could try to keep varying forms of control and influence on another. So, annual or biannual campaigns out in the region just to march near you. Like, we're still here. Just
But
don't
also,
get out of line.
Right, but even if you don't have the resources to do that, and Ramses II is starting to feel pressure on other fronts, right, from Libya, from Sea Peoples in the Mediterranean, right, the groups that become the Sea Peoples that eventually kind of come into Egypt in a big wave under Ramses III. There are things, there are pressures on him at home that I suspect might have really lessened the amount of resources he was able to bring to bear on controlling Canaan. And after Kadesh in year 5, the writing is probably on the wall that those big, like you said, Josh, taking a big army and marching it through to really show that power may become less and less feasible. And that's the point where softer forms of control, are helpful, right? Like you have these, like even the Battle of Kadesh, right? There are people coming, going, and spying and trying to favor the Egyptian side or favor these are Canaanites, right? Bedouin trying to influence the balance of power in one way or another. And, if you live, there are Egyptians living in your area, you communicated with them, you know them, you have good relationships with them, and you associate them with stability, even if that the funding to do these big military marches is waning, that's another type of imperial presence, imperial control. America, controls a lot of the world because people like the stuff we have, right? Arguably. And again, that's a desperate oversimplification. I should not have said that because now I'm going to be like second guessing myself on B subject to all kinds of. But what I'm saying is that right there are kinds of soft or cultural ways that you can exert yourself in a region. But in this particular case, I would say that Ramses II probably faced issues controlling at least the northern part of Canaan effectively. And certainly, I would think he felt like he probably couldn't maintain a substantial military presence in the northern end of that Canaanite region because, as I said, the Hittites beat him at Kadesh. He tried to present it as this huge victory, right? And it's a major talking point. Like the Battle of Kadesh is plastered all over Egyptian temples, but the upshot is that he lost.
Listed everywhere.
And I think Falk actually mentioned that Ramses II stops campaigning in Syria, Palestine in year 18. But
Yes.
flip slides, what happens around that time? You guys remember? I wonder if any of your viewers remember. What happens around year 18, 20 of Ramses II? Next slide.
You stumped me. Oh, the next slide? You have to show us because I'm not picking it up.
I forget who's driving the slides here. Right? It's the Treaty of Kadesh.
Oh,
the Egyptians make peace with the Hittites in year 21.
Yes.
So you wouldn't necessarily expect Ramses II to be campaigning extensively, right? Because what would he be campaigning to do? Why would you be marching big armies through Canaan in a show of force to an empire that you just went to all this trouble to negotiate a peace treaty with?
Yeah. No,
right? You've established marriage alliances.
Yeah.
Right. It's not necessarily the case that he's completely lost control, but there is a new political order based on a perception on the Egyptian side. They're weaker, I think. But again, what bearing at all that has on the Exodus narrative escapes me. I don't see how this is relevant because in order to have an Exodus, you have to have Israelites. And that's something I don't see any evidence for at all in Egypt. And that's a different story, right? So it's fine, right? We've gone to all this trouble to talk about this, but the thing that really gets to me, and again, I don't think Faulk is wrong. Like I said, to question the extent of Egyptian control in Canaan under Ramses II, I don't think he's wrong that there are scholars who are interested in the potential historicity of aspects of the Exodus narrative. But I don't see how any given point of historical fact is at all relevant. Like all of this is kind of beside the point. It has nothing to do with the Exodus, I don't think. And that just might be me.
I think no, that makes a lot of sense to me. But I think we've got a few super chats and some questions coming in. I'll get to those in a little bit, but I think this is a good point to maybe move on to some of Falk's next talking points, which are about Ramses campaigns and the battle of Kadesh.
So it doesn't seem like Egypt, and we've talked about this before, had like this super strong empire in Canaan. And the Hittites are also pushing them further south through this period. It's not like they had control of all of Canaan throughout the 13th century. Is that correct?
Can you pause
That
it
is
for just
correct.
a second?
In fact,
Yes, sir.
I just, who's arguing that? Like, who has made this argument that they had this super strong control? The point of Ponetz Cohen's quote was that there was a heightening of control, right?
Mhm.
It wasn't that there was this like blanketing, or there's that, as Maggie was saying, there's like somebody on every street corner or something. So I feel like this is a little bit of a straw man to say. Yeah, go ahead, please.
Not if you read sort of like introductory textbooks, right? Because if you are trying to zoom out on a couple centuries of Egyptian history, if you read like on Wikipedia, right, Egyptian Empire, New Kingdom, Late Bronze Age, 1550 to 1000 BCE, Egypt has an empire in the Levant. That's what you might understand from that. It's when you zoom in on these kind of more, you kind of get more granularity that you can start. So like over the course of a decade, right? Like one of those Egyptian garrisons might be staffed in the reign of Ramses II, not in the reign of Ramses or the reign of Merneptah, and then staffed again later or restaffed in the 20th dynasty. Like that level of granularity is something that people don't get from reading introductory textbooks. And so I can see where somebody might get that idea.
Sure. And maybe, and if that's what's going on here, that's great. Like if they're responding to general like introductory conceptions of Egypt during this period, awesome. Hey, like that's the thing is, in the context, it seemed like they were responding to presenting a position that like we were arguing for, and I don't see that.
And I think too, with this idea that the Hittites are pushing farther south, I think people have the impression, pushing farther south into, like the Judean highlands, which to my way of thinking, the Hittites are when the Hittites are pushing farther south. Correct me if I'm wrong, but this is kind of like into the Amudu region, surrounding Kadesh and Byblos, and maybe as far as Tyre, but that's still quite a ways north of the of the region that eventually becomes properly Israel and Judah.
Very much so. I mean, we're talking essentially about Phoenicia and areas inland of the Phoenician coast. This is modern day Lebanon.
Can we put the map back up just so that the audience can kind of get an idea?
For sure.
Because I think this is an important point.
Yeah. Can you put that back up for me, Maggie?
Can y'all see that? Let me see if I can share it.
You need to share it again.
Stop sharing. All right, let me give this a try here. But yeah, I mean, we're talking about Lebanon effectively. Let me show. And again, I just grabbed this map off the internet, but I think it's from the University of Memphis, and I'm pretty
there
sure
it is. Sorry, I had I had switched some things around here. Yeah. So just to give people go ahead.
And you're not finding Hittite material culture. You're not finding Hittite tablets, in modern day Israel. What you're finding, there's abundant material culture evidence of Egyptian interaction, if not control, whereas the Hittite sphere of influence is in modern day Lebanon and not south of it in this period. And Kadesh basically puts that border right on the Orontes River, or at the sort of,
Yeah, exactly.
right around the latitude of Beirut.
So just to give people a sense here, like this is still quite far north. The city of Tyre is on the northern edge of like the kingdom of Omri of Israel there. So you're not even getting nowhere close to any of the sites really that are even mentioned in Joshua's northern campaign of the conquest. So like this is not as I look at this, you tend to think if this is like a heat map, Egyptian control does tend to get stronger the farther south you go. And most all of the military activity that's mentioned in the book of Joshua and that's envisioned, the region that's envisioned for the idealized United Kingdom of Israel, this is predominantly quite a ways farther south. So I'm gonna continue playing this.
Sorry.
Throwing spitballs from the back of the classroom.
So I have to raise a question here, just because this is something that piqued my interest
Oh,
after
Kip,
hearing it a couple of times.
I
Yeah.
don't think you
Oh,
shared
did we not
yeah.
sheet? Oh, god damn it.
That's
I
why you were
always
sitting there
do this.
quietly,
This is-
because you were watching the video.
Yes.
You were just
I was
enjoying your
watching
own
the
video.
video. I
I
was. Okay. Sorry, guys. I gotta share the video that I just enjoyed in the privacy of my own earbuds.
Losing it by the 5th year of Ramses II.
Okay. Let me
Right.
just back up a little bit
Century.
more.
Is that
Oh, no.
correct?
That is correct. In fact, they start losing it by the 5th year of Ramses II. Ramses II in his Kaddish inscriptions already notes that the Philistines, the sea peoples, are coming into the coastal plain.
Mm-hmm.
So y'all heard that time, right? So okay, but this is something that that I didn't key in on until after seeing it a couple of times. But this mention of the sea people coming into the coastal plain by the time of the Battle of Kadesh, and something that is actually mentioned by Ramses II on the Kaddish inscription. I'm unsure where this comes from. I mean, I've read the Kaddish inscription before, and I'm unclear about this mention of incursions of the sea people.
Give me 1 second. I should be able to. It is slipping my mind right now, but I know what he's talking about. Do you guys have something you can chat about for a second while I go flip through my?
Yeah, I mean, I know because I know
there is. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, Kip and I, messaged back and forth a little bit about this, and I pulled my trusty old 2-volume Lichtime out and read through a better portion of the inscription, and like the Luca are mentioned a number of times, which of course is a group of the sea peoples.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I was curious.
But even then, what is like I think Ramses mentions a number of people groups that are coming into the region with the Hittites, right?
Yeah, that's right.
And I don't like I as far as I can tell, this is all pretty far north. In and around the area of Byblos, and but yeah.
I will say, I wanted to, while we're waiting for Maggie, I wanted to push back on both of you, because like I disagree wholeheartedly that Ramses II had this, did anything but a resounding win. Because look, I read this inscription.
He says it. You read the
don't you
inscription,
remember?
right?
Like all his forces, right, were like, oh my gosh, taken by, and he, man,
That's right.
he just girded on up and went and blazed
by the power of Ray.
I mean, come on,
So,
like I don't.
maybe while Maggie's looking some of that stuff up, maybe there's a couple things we can answer.
Sorry, guys. It's a year. It's year two. It's year 2.
Oh, all right.
And I remember the Sheridan, and I'm just trying to flip through and see if I can figure out what
I like saying
Okay.
Weshesh. Weshesh.
I'm just gonna grab a couple of these super chats here that maybe you and I can address. There's a few here that I think.
Does somebody want me to do some beatboxing? Is that what it is?
Yeah.
Watch,
absolutely.
Maggie is like really trying hard not to face palm right now. She's like resisting her hand coming up. No.
She's like, oh my God, how did I end up on this show with these clowns? What is going on? All right. Oh, is she frozen? Oh, maybe not. Okay. I thought we could
handle this one.
Do you think the idea of the Exodus was written against Manetho?
I mean, I know that you're probably super well read on Manetho, but
I'm not super well read on Manetho.
So I'm gonna say, maybe it's all a journey. There you go. That's my answer.
It could be. So, I mean, I think the original Exodus traditions are probably quite a bit earlier than Manetho, because Manetho's he's writing like in the Persian period, isn't he? Or am I wrong?
But it depends on what we mean by was written.
I guess so. Yeah.
Right? If we're talking about this like final, redacted form, bringing these early traditions in, it's
no.
Yeah. Okay, I guess we did have something to say about that.
Maybe we had something to say about that. And maybe we can let's see.
Maggie, just interrupt us whenever you're ready. Just be like, all right,
as soon as you're ready to go, just throw in. I saw this one, and I've got some thoughts on this. Didn't a small
it's a
group
Stella at Us one? I knew it. I was trying to find the text.
All right. Did you find it?
It's a Stella at Us one, yeah. Year 2.
I think there might be a lag.
So yeah, again.
Is there a lag, Maggie?
There might be.
Yeah.
Are you guys hearing me okay?
I can hear you. Yeah, I think there's a little bit of a delay.
So is this? So I guess what is when the sea people in the Kaddish inscription? What's he getting at here then? Oh, hello. Can she hear me?
Oh, so hi. I can hear you. Yes. So there are incursions by the Sheridan, which is a group that later appears among the Sea People in Ramses III's inscriptions. And Merneptah, is it in the Merneptah Sea People's inscription too? Right. So the Sea Peoples are not a brand new thing in the reign of Ramses III. Right. Some of those groups are known and are already starting to put pressure on the Egyptians.
Absolutely.
Earlier in the 19th dynasty. But again, I'm still not sure I understand what bearing that has on the Exodus. And we talked about that earlier. I was saying, so Ramses has problems. This might have been before we were live, but I was saying that Ramses II has problems on his western and northern fronts. He has problems on the southern front, right? Because Nubia is always a potential threat.
Right.
Right. It's not that Egypt was ever in a vacuum, and Ramses II rules Egypt for a very long time. But regardless, there are Egyptians in Canaan in this period. There is an Egyptian presence there that Ramses is trying to maintain in the early part of his reign through military activity, and then later in his reign through this agreement with the Hittites. So
Okay. All right. I'm gonna push play on the video. I think it's still up here, so everyone should be able to hear it. You can all hear
So
that,
if
right?
they're already coming into the coastal plain, they're already losing it on one of the major routes that they went on campaign.
And Baruch Halpern even says before Ramesses III, this was happening.
Oh yeah,
Like Egypt no longer it was in a condition to project power beyond its borders, even before Ramesses III. So into the, I would guess, one would assume into the 1300s. That is, no, sorry, 1200s.
We start seeing this as early as the Amarna period. That's when we see this. The earliest we see this. In fact, there's one Amarna letter where it talks about a raid of sea peoples into the coastal plain.
All right. No, I better not push that button. I'll just pull that off. Yeah. I did want to include this. And I think we already talked a little bit about the Ramesside period more generally, and we've talked a little bit about what the rule of Ramesses II looked like in Egypt. I'm curious about some of this, the statements by the way Michael is characterizing this based on some of the things written by Baruch Halpern. This claim of diminishing control before Ramses III, is this like an accurate read on the situation? Because I think it's Merneptah who's after Ramses II, right? And then Ramses III who follows Merneptah.
no, there's a kind of a few difficult years after Merneptah before you get to Ramses III.
Yes.
So you have this period when there's a kind of there are a couple of different contests for the Egyptian throne. So Ramses so Merneptah is followed by Seti II and Amenmosa in some order, right? It's not clear 100%. Right now, the thought is that Seti II succeeds Merneptah, and then Amenmosa tries to take the throne from Seti II and is unsuccessful. And then you have the Siptah 𝀀 sort of interlude, right, where there's the young king Siptah, Queen Mother 𝀀 who ends up, after Siptah dies, ruling for a couple of years in her own right, is followed by Sethnacht, who's the father of Ramses III. So it's a matter of of some years before we get to Ramses III. But yeah, I mean, the Sea peoples are not something that happens all at once. The Mycenaean Empire starts to collapse, in the 13th century BCE. And aren't the Sea peoples in the Amarna letters the Denyen? Isn't that the Danaoi, the Greeks?
See, this is like this is sort of what I'm struggling with when I hear these sort of chronological markers that they're going through, like the earliest that we see this. What is that meant to indicate? So we see it in the Amarna period. Therefore, from that point on, there's continuous pressure. Like that's the way that sort of comes across to me. And, this, again, I think we'll talk about this at some point, but this is sort of, it feels in the same vein as the Amorites, right? When we talked, I mean, Maggie will remember this, when we talked about the Amorites, the third millennium and the second millennium, and who were they and how did it function? And I think you were in that same class when we had to write that, like we had to critique and write our own Wikipedia entry for the Amorites, like all of that stuff, Jebel Bishri and all, like it was like this continuous. And so much of this was a question of like, what are we looking at, this monolithic, or this homogenistic group that's all coming in and conquering and take, or are we talking about people that were always there? And it sort of feels like it's following that same sort of pattern where, well, we see a group that's identified later in the inscriptional evidence as a part of the sea peoples, and we see them back here. And so what? Like, therefore what? That's the therefore what is what I'm still sort of, as you say, hanging on, you know?
I struggle with that too, especially because I don't think anybody puts the lifetime of Abraham in the late Bronze Age, according to the book of chronology. And he supposedly interacted with Philistines, who are sea peoples. They're the Palisade, right? At least in principle. We can't push that timeline back. We can't make that work. So why do you want, so if I'm understanding correctly, the line of reasoning is the sea peoples are exerting pressure on Egypt already in the reign of Ramses II, which means, right, the footprint of Egypt in the Levant is becoming, if not smaller, then shallower, right? The Egyptians are not, they don't have as heavy, as abundant a presence in Canaan, and the extent of their territorial control is lessened. All of that, I think, is probably true. You know, I don't think, you know, in fairness, I think that's a perfectly reasonable thing to understand. But Josh, your point about the so what, I think, is really the key one. I don't know what that tells us about Israelites. Because for starters, we still have to sort out what Exodus we're talking. This is something I keep coming back to. Listening to these questions that you guys are asking, listening to these things that we're talking about, like, historiographically, if we are going to talk about the historicity of anything, we have to agree first on the parameters we want to use for that discussion. We have to talk about what premises we want to test against what evidence, right? And I'm not, the thing to do responsibly would be to start by saying, here is how I understand the Exodus. Here's what I think the biblical narrative is saying in detail, right? And then test each point against the evidence that you have from outside sources. And then go back to it and say, okay, well, here's what we could change depending on what results we get. And that's not what I'm hearing. It's very scattershot. It sounds to me just like, you know, kind of like throwing darts to see what sticks. I mean, is that an unfair impression on my part?
No, I think you're probably right about that.
I mean, they certainly do have, certainly Falk does, and I think Michael does as well, but I think it's been heavily influenced by David.
I think so.
Like a systematic-ish view, right? It's predicated on a particular view of the Hebrew Bible, and so I don't think it's certainly coming across that way in many of these video clips. That is true. But I think, if, you know, to be fair to them, I think if we were to play back through, what does Michael have, like a 3-part video series or something on this, or at least one part of the 3? I don't know.
I think it's properly
remember.
there's three videos that he made about the Exodus and the conquest. That's what you're talking about, right?
Yeah, that's right. So
Yeah.
like they do have a view, and they do have a particular year or close to it
I think
that they want to see, and like they
they've
have an idea of
isolated
which
it in
pharaoh, all that stuff.
1225 Ramses II. But I think
I will never understand why that works any better than the reigns of Thutmose III and Amenhotep II for the oppression and Exodus. Simply because, right, the city of Avaris is literally, that's 2 kilometers from the city of Pi-Ramessé, right? If the Exodus narrative first finds its solidified form in the 13th century BCE, right, the story is being told from the perspective of a teller in the 13th century BCE. They might know the region around Avaris as Pi-Ramessé, but there are Canaanites living in Egypt. There is construction and activity at Avaris, you know, and then Amenhotep II comes to the throne. Avaris is temporarily abandoned. You know, there are different points in Egyptian history, right? Avaris is built. You can go back to the 17th century BCE, early mid 16th century BCE, right? Avaris is built up over time by Canaanites. They are driven out by the Egyptians. Avaris is abandoned for a brief period, right? And then it's repopulated. That story, if you are willing to be flexible about any element of it, you can make it fit with so many different scenarios in Egyptian history. I'm
Sure you
just not
can.
sure I see any. It's kind of like the whole Potiphar thing. It's like I'm saying, there is a smoking gun, but I don't know what they're wanting to shoot with it. Does that make sense? Like you.
So maybe that's actually
And that's why.
that's a
Go ahead.
no. I was going to say I threw this one in here because I think this kind of gets to maybe the rationale where David Falk has actually redrawn the map of Egyptian of basically Egypt and Canaan in the reign of Ramses II. And I think this is for the purposes of forwarding this narrative about the Exodus.
One of the biggest myths that I encounter is that the promised land at the time of the Israelite conquest was controlled by the Egyptians, and that they controlled Canaan with an iron fist and was a mighty empire all across the Levant. And we're going to put up here a map that is circa 1283 to 1270 BC. Now, this is before the Israelite conquest. This map shows us the Egyptian hegemony as it was from 1283 to 1270 BC.
Can we pause it for just a
highlighted
second?
in orange.
Because that, and Maggie, you will have much more to say about this. That is the kind of misleading highlight that, Maggie, I think you were maybe referring to. Because while I understand the point, right, and I think that can, from a pedagogical standpoint, that can be really useful, right? When you talk about like how wide did the Assyrian rule, extend, and you like sort of show as it expands out, in parts of the Middle Assyrian period, and then it contracts back in, like. But that's when you talk about that granularity, that sort of misses it. And so this is why, like, when we moved from this idea of the oil stain to the what was it? It was like a net, right? The net view of the Assyrians. Anyway, that sort of jumps out at me. Like, would you say that represents the granularity that you were referring to earlier, or do you think this is more of a, from a like heuristic standpoint, like being useful more that way from an introductory standpoint?
Yeah, it's useful from an introductory and heuristic standpoint. Absolutely.
I
noticed that it extends into the Transjordan quite a way.
That's true. Yes.
We'll get there.
But I mean, it looks very. This particular map looks very similar to the one that you posted.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's a very good reflection. And I think Faulk keeps coming back to the idea that the Egyptians have it. We got it lag, Kip.
Yeah. Well. Okay. We'll see what he has to say here about Ramses II.
That's the period of the Battle of Kadesh under Ramses II, essentially his fifth regnal year. This represents the area of control that Egyptian had over the Levant as a hegemonic power. Now, using the term hegemony is a better term than empire, because Egypt never really had an empire. Empires were expensive. And empires are more about cultural influence and control, which, frankly, Egypt had very little interest in. Egypt wanted only one thing out of its vassals: tribute, that is, loot, and lots of it. For Egypt, hegemony was about getting lots of goods into Egypt to offset its crippling 3,000 years of inflation. So, when we talk about the hegemony of Egypt over the Levant, politically, most of the states under Egyptian control exercised a large amount of freedom. That freedom even extended to waging wars of conquest against their neighbors. As long as Egypt got its loot, it didn't much care what happened to those city-states of Canaan. Now, this map shows the theoretical control that Egypt had over Canaan during the campaigns of Ramses II. And Ramses II's final campaign was in his 18th regnal year. However, their absolute control over the region started to diminish over the next 50 years, following Ramses II's final campaign in 1270 BC. By 1225 BC, the actual control Egypt had over Canaan looked more like our next map. By 1225 BC, other powers had greater influence over the Levant than the Egyptians. The Egyptians still controlled the coastal plain and Shephelah in name, but not in practice. Other powers controlled the Levant to a greater extent by this point.
I mean, I guess there are questions about the extent to which he's using even just the words control. He mentions at one point there, an Egyptian presence or influence versus, I guess governance might be a way to think about it, but I suspect that the efforts to draw the map in this way are to counter many of this idea that an exodus at this particular time doesn't make much sense, just because you're moving out of an an area controlled by Egypt into a region controlled by Egypt. But yeah.
It would an exodus out of a region controlled by Egypt into a region controlled less by Egypt could make sense in principle, and I guess that's what that map is arguing for.
I think that's the hope. I'm kind of interested to hear your thoughts on 3,000 years of crippling inflation.
So it is news to me that Egypt's reason, that Ramses II, so the 19th dynasty's reason for having garrisons in the Levant, was to address a steady 3,000 years of inflation. I absolutely don't know. I mean, Egypt under Amenhotep III, just a few generations earlier, is the land where gold is like dust. I mean, they were able to they could fund armies and building, and I don't get the sense that the average Egyptian was necessarily doing a whole lot worse in 1350 BCE than he was in 1750 BCE. Because Egypt goes through periods where it's like you cannot be in one place for 3,000 years and not have downturns in your circumstances. But the idea of 3,000 years of inflation just...
I mean, I think actually...
I'm hoping he misspoke. They had some good times while it lasted.
That was actually it's this one here. I think it was actually Chris Rathos. 3,000 years of inflation just sounds impossible. It's such it's just such an enormous period of time. And
I'm struggling with that one.
So many things happening. So I don't know. And I do wonder as well, something, I have questions about how making these finer distinctions between specifically what a hegemony is and what an empire is. I think some of that is possibly nitpicking. Not every empire looks the same, and not every empire is operating under the same conditions to the same results either.
I mean, I think I get it. I think that the argument is still, just like you and Josh have pointed out a few times already, that if Egypt is not controlling the Levant in the sense that there are not like Egyptian army patrols walking around, there are not, the people, Canaanite, the leaders of these Canaanite city-states are not automatically obliged to do exactly what the Pharaoh says and not get at each other's throats, right? If you want to invade, if you want to invade without leaving a record, you don't want to come into an area where there are lots and lots of literate people regularly patrolling all of the pathways along which you might move a large army. So I get it. That makes sense. If you want to argue that 600,000 men of fighting age could walk in across the Jordan River and not meet Egyptian resistance per se, right? Exactly, not actually run into the Egyptian army, then you have to pause at a time when the Canaanite city-states were very independent and there were not a lot of Egyptians, at least in an organized capacity in the Levant. And that makes sense. I don't necessarily think the time of Ramses II is that time. I don't think that you could have had an army that large wreaking that much havoc in, parts of the world where Egypt had historically had a military presence and seemed to want to maintain stability. Right? Because if the city-states of Canaan are fighting against each other, war is not great for getting tribute to a third party. It's not in the best interests of the Egyptians for there to be ongoing chaos and destruction, particularly not of the kind that the Israelites say in Joshua they're inflicting on Canaan. Because some Canaanite city-states don't do that badly, but the mandate was harem, right? It was just the obliteration of livestock, of infrastructure. The Israelite conquest would not have been great for the Egyptian Empire. And in the reign of Ramses II, I can see an Egypt struggling to maintain direct control on a very deep and wide scale, but I don't see a geopolitical picture where either the Egyptians or the Hittites or even the Assyrians, somebody would not have said, hold on, guys, this is a problem. And at least put up some roadblocks that we would hear about in the Hebrew Bible, if not elsewhere. So that's my take on that.
Right. So I think just kind of looking at the time here, and I don't want to keep you too long, so I think we'll just move on here into this next part of the video, where Faulk has some things to say about Bowen.
To particular interpretations of the biblical text are not the only sites under investigation here.
Here, Josh and I did I add that to the stage? Oh, good, I did. I'm not very good at this, guys. Here we're in the original video, Josh and I are discussing the extent of on a larger scale, just what the archaeological record shows about a variety of sites across the region of Canaan, where there is said to be this massive destruction by hordes of invading Israelites.
Would remind you of sites like Arad in the Negev, Heshbon and Dibon in Transjordan. These were all said to have been destroyed by the invading Israelite army. But Arad, following occupation in the 3rd millennium BCE, was abandoned until after the Late Bronze Age, leaving behind no city in existence for the Israelites to destroy. A similar picture can be seen in Heshbon, where archaeology reveals that there was no occupation earlier than 1200. Finally, at Dibon, we see early Bronze Age levels, followed by a break in occupation, which is only reestablished in the Iron Age.
All right, Dr. Falk. All right, you're an Egyptologist. How have you never considered Dibon as a site that wasn't occupied in the Late Bronze Age?
I don't know. I must not be up on the literature, obviously. Because when I go to Luxor Temple and I read Wall E on there, it says that Ramses II plundered Dibon. I mean, clearly Ramses was wrong. He obviously picked up his campaign, went to Dibon, and found nothing there. He was disappointed that he plundered a city that didn't exist.
All right. So we have a situation where archaeologists have excavated at the site that most believe to be identified with Dibon in the Levant, and have found no occupations early enough to align with either an early or a late conquest. But Faulk here claims that Ramses II actually campaigned in Dibon and fought against the city. Any idea what he's talking about here? He mentioned he talks about the Luxor Temple and an inscription on Wall E, where Ramses describes plundering Dibon.
Yeah. So it's kind of in the tradition of the toponym list. The Egyptians loved lists. They loved to publish lists of good things that they had done. And one of the good things that a king of Egypt could do was punish rebellious vassals. And so there are, throughout the New Kingdom and before, there are these sort of litanies of places that the kings march to with their armies, the campaigns. They're just campaign itineraries. Basically, they're, and a lot of people look at them as kind of like monumentalizations of day books. This is what the Egyptian army did. These are their campaigns. Sometimes they seem to reflect real campaign itineraries, and sometimes they seem to be more sort of a propaganda piece that is, if not wholly, then at least in part based on earlier examples of these campaign itineraries. So like somebody who a later king who wants to cast himself as the new Thutmose III might pinch snippets from his campaign itineraries to kind of seem even more campaigny. The scene he is thinking about at Luxor Temple, and I made some slides because you dropped this into an email to me before tonight, and I actually put some pictures together because this is one. Let me see if I can get this on the screen. The trouble with these toponym lists is that they don't necessarily have coordinates. I'm not sure where Falk's confidence that Dibon is modern day Dibon, Jordan, in the ancient kingdom of Moab comes from, except isn't Faulk a Liverpool Egyptologist?
He is. Yeah. Yes.
So the inscription that he is talking about that mentions Dibon was first published by Kenneth Kitchen in 1964. I think Kitchen is the first edition of this text. Anyway, he's definitely the one I think of. And obviously, I mean, Kitchen, and this is not to disparage Kitchen or Liverpool Egyptology by any means. I mean, Kitchen's contributions to the field are impossible to overstate. But I wonder if his confidence that Dibon is Dibon Jordan comes from the fact that this is an inscription that Kitchen published that talks about a campaign of Ramses II, and one of the locations that he supposedly captures or sacks that he conquers in this campaign is a place called Tibuniu. And right, that's how it's spelled in hieroglyphs. And plausibly, right, this is a syllabic writing that's meant to represent the sounds of a non-Egyptian language. And plausibly, it could have been something like Dibon. In fact, it probably was. The problem there is that it doesn't say where Dibon is. There are no coordinates. And in fact, there are other places called Dibon or something similar in the Hebrew Bible by itself that are not in Moab, that are not in the Transjordan. So there's a Judean Dibon that's mentioned in Nehemiah. And there's a city called Dimona that pops up in Joshua. Both of those seem to be in Judea or in certainly Cisjordan, right? Kiryat Arba, of course, is Hebron, so I've marked that. Because a lot of times in these toponym lists, you'll find that cities are grouped. There's some kind of geographical order to them. So if people of Judah are living there, that's near Kiryat Arba, that's being mentioned in the same breath as this Dibon, it's probably a Judean city, town. So anyway, there are a couple of other potential Dibons to begin with, and a lot of people who have looked at that inscription since Kitchen have said, oh, this must be the Judean Dibon, which is only certainly attested in the Hebrew Bible in the context of after the exile, right? So this is in the context of the return. But there's also this city mentioned in Joshua, Dimona, right? And B and M are related sounds. So it's the Judean Dibon is actually called Dimona in Isaiah, probably in a way as a kind of pun to make it sound more like blood or something like that, if I understand correctly. But again, Hebrew is not my thing, so apologies, Kip. Anyway, my point is that there are no coordinates attached to the Dibon in Ramses' in the Ramses campaign itinerary. In that those inscriptions at Luxor Temple that Faulk is talking about. And in fact, so when Kitchen first published the inscription, when he first read it, there is another place not far from the place. So basically it's almost like it's like a comic book, like a comic strip, where you see different scenes of the king at different points in his campaigns. And you can see the stairs to the mosque. So I can kind of picture in my head where this is. Because there is the mosque of Abu Hagag is built on top of Luxor Temple's courtyard. But there is a place called 𝀭which sounds very much like Moab. And of course, Moab is the region, later the kingdom where Dibon Jordan is located. The problem here is, again, it sounds very good. The top register here is clearly talking about all of the battles, all of the things that happen in this top register of this section, this wall of the courtyard, are happening around Kadesh. They're happening near that Egyptian Hittite frontier that we talked about earlier that was such a big thing for Ramses II. And then Kitchen's interpretation was, okay, that's fine. The top register talks about a northern campaign and the bottom register talks about a southern campaign. Again, perfectly plausible, makes absolute sense. But again, it's not a smoking gun. This Dibon, as I've said, there are Cisjordanian possibilities for where it could be, we know from the Hebrew Bible, and the other toponyms. So like, for instance, Dibon, the scene that it's in, the scene B here in the bottom register, there's another place there called the Mountain of Merarin. And nobody knows where it is exactly, but there's another inscription, Papyrus Anastasi, or another inscription, another text, Papyrus Anastasi 1, that has a Kur Merarin near Kadesh. Again, in that Hittite frontier region. And Josh, you might correct me, but Kur, I feel like, has something to do with mountains in Mesopotamia.
That's right, mountain and land.
And then they managed, so when Kitchen first read this inscription, there was debris covering part of the wall. You couldn't actually see the whole inscription. And he read a toponym, a place name called Buteret. And again, nobody knew where that was, but again, there's no reason why it couldn't be in Moab. And in fact, Kitchen found a candidate for it. But they cleared off more of the area around that place name and found, in fact, that there is a place called Buteret, right? That the location of Buteret might actually be near Kadesh, because there's a speech to the ruler of Buteret in the portion of the scene that they uncovered, where it talks about the king of Buteret or the ruler of Buteret making a treaty with the Hittites, which makes perfect sense if we're talking about a Canaanite city in modern day Israel or Lebanon, not so much sense if we're talking about Moab, right? In a total, right? Because Moab, just to remind everybody, is here. Up here is where the Hittites are. You know, it would make sense for someone up here to turn away from the Egyptians and look to the Hittites for protection and support. But why?
Right.
If Buteret is in Moab, why would they be looking for a Hittite alliance, particularly given the fact that we have reason to think that some of the other action that's happening, not just in that top register, but also in the bottom register, could be happening in the northern part of Cisjordanian Canaan. So again, it's not impossible that Ramses II campaigned in Moab. You can't prove a negative. Just pure formal logic dictates that you can't prove a negative. But again, until we find better evidence that Moab was extensively settled, right, and by Moab, I'm talking here about the Iron Age kingdom, that it was extensively settled, that it was called Moab in the late Bronze Age, that the city of Dibon had any occupation between, or any site around it that could remotely be considered ancient Dibon, right? Because the modern town might not actually be, right? The places where we've excavated, we might just have missed the late Bronze Age settlement, right? But until we have evidence that there was a late Bronze Age settlement there, we can't settle this question. And it's not something that you can snidely pass off as evidence that nobody's read the literature, that nobody knows what's happening here. You know, this is not about beef. This is about the fact that there are different ways to read this text, different ways to interpret it, I mean. Different ways to interpret this courtyard, right? This body of scenes. So this complex of information.
If I was going to say, if we're playing by apologetics rules, but I mean, if we are, isn't the possibility?
That's enough, I suppose.
I'm saying that half kidding, but half not. So,
well,
but that's the thing, Josh. You've really hit on it. It's all about possibilities, not about probabilities, not about. I mean, and this is something, again, to argue that there are no atheists in the world who desperately want everything in the Hebrew Bible to be a fairy tale,
right,
I think would also probably be untrue. And I think that it is possible to make a mistake from any presupposition, right? To interpret evidence badly from any pre-existing ideological position. But in this particular case, and because we haven't even talked about the fact that I still maintain, if you're going to have an Exodus, you have to have Israelites. And that's where the big problem comes in.
Yeah, this is something.
It's a significant one. Yeah. Go on, Josh. Sorry.
This is something that, like, Maggie's, the three of us have been sort of interacting over the past month or so about this. One of the things that I've heard you say, sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly, is that it feels like, as you just sort of said, it's not about building necessarily a case from the data. In other words, taking the data and saying, okay, now what interpretive model best accounts for these data points? It's, all right, we have our interpretive model. Now let's get these data points. How can they fit into our interpretive model, right? And if, well, this one doesn't seem to work, like the Bowen thing, just in case anybody doesn't, like, isn't catching why this is relevant, is that there are lots of sites in Transjordan and elsewhere that they either have meager late Bronze Age material culture or none that we have found. And so Dibon falls into that category. And so if it's supposed to be this major site that's conquered, on its face, that's problematic. And so the response here, of course, is that, well, yeah, the archaeology might not be there. Maybe there's, secondary and tertiary deposits that were then, cut away or whatever, and that's why we don't have them. Fine. But as it stands, right, we can't build the case with the archaeology. Right? We can't make that case with the archaeology. And those that are excavating at the site and those archaeologists that work in the region are ostensibly saying, look, this is a problem. This is a problem for the biblical narrative. So I think that's important, I think, to at least throw some attention to for a moment.
No, Absolutely. And just to kind of build on that, Josh, I think what scholars are trying to do is gain a stronger cumulative, more comprehensive sense of how these texts fit in to what's happening in the region, and what we big picture see taking place in the region is this emergence of smaller independent kingdoms starting to occur after, the 11th, the 10th, the 9th century, is really when you start to see the emergence of Moab, the emergence of Edom, the emergence of a kingdom in Jerusalem, and the big one in Omri's kingdom in Samaria, and the kingdom of Aram. It just seems to align better with understanding that these texts are products of this later period, as opposed to trying to shoehorn, the kingdom of Moab into a place where it doesn't. Yeah, it doesn't. I don't know. Is it there? We can't really tell. There's nothing clear that early.
Well, here's the other thing, and I keep coming back to this, and I will continue to come back to this. I don't understand why, if Ramses II did campaign in Moab, that means the Exodus was more likely to have happened.
Right.
Did anybody tell him that there were Israelites in Moab? I mean, again, the name Moab, I mean, if we just because a kingdom, we see it for the first time in the Iron Age, doesn't mean that it doesn't have roots in an earlier period. That's fine.
Mm-hmm.
And just because there isn't a lot of settled, there's no evidence of a settled population in the area around Bowen in the late Bronze Age, it doesn't mean there was no reason for him to go there. The Egyptians had conflicts with mobile people, right? They were constantly at it with one 𝀭Support group or another. The point is that in this case, for one thing, there are two different ways to interpret the complex of information that has led people to posit a Moabite campaign for Ramses II. So it's not a done deal that he went on a Moabite campaign. The second thing is that if he did, first of all, in the Iron Age, it's possible that there could have been, right, reason for people either to imagine that he might have, right, that Moab had been important that early. Right there, again, I think I'm starting to lose the thread here, but anyway, it is possible for people to retroject, right? And there is no reason why, if Ramses II was in Moab in the 13th century BCE, that has to mean that it has any bearing whatsoever on the Hebrew Bible, the events, the reality of the events that it purports to narrate. Right?
If I could just sort of maybe put a little bit of icing on the cake here, and to make sure that I'm clear about what I said, SJ in the chat said, "Are you saying you can't build a case for the archaeology in the 13th century?" So I'm assuming she was talking about what we were talking about at Bowen. And no, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is a better analogy, or a good analogy to this, might be if you have a prosecutor who identifies, the police bring Frank as a possible suspect in a crime, and the prosecutor becomes convinced from an early conversation with the police or whatever that, yep, Frank's the one that did this, and starts from that bit of information in the beginning. Yep, this Frank must be the guy, and starts to build this case and starts to run into problems as more information comes in, right? Frank is supposed to have been, over on Cherry Street at 9:00. Well, I mean, his cell phone pings at 8:47, 6 blocks away, right? And I mean, I'm not great at math and travel and stuff, but I mean, it feels like that's, in the city or something, maybe that, like, it's really difficult to see a nine or like an 847 ping 6 blocks away. And then, this thing's supposed to happen or 12 blocks away or 50 blocks away. I don't know. Like, sorry, I don't know the time travel, how long it would take to travel. But that prosecutor might say, well, now, if he got on a motorcycle and he kind of ran 2 red lights, he could have gotten there. He could have gotten there to commit that murder. And we know that he rode a motorcycle in the past. So and there probably was a motorcycle there. So it's possible. It's possible that he could have done that. That's sort of, you're not coming to the data first and formulating how it ties together in a model. Instead, in that case, you have your suspect and you're trying to see, could this new data point still work? That's the difference.
Mm-hmm.
Can I jump in here too, Josh?
Please.
Another way to look at this is to say the problem isn't that you cannot build a case for the Exodus narrative from the archaeology of the 13th century BCE. The problem is that you can take that same evidence that you would use to build a case for the historicity of the Exodus and build one against it, or you could also build a case for the historicity of the Exodus for the 15th century BCE or the 17th century BCE from archaeological data, or the
12th century BCE.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like there are several directions to go here.
We've completely left out the whole Seti II Amenmesu, Sethnach complex of narrative.
And
right?
What was that article?
There are people who have argued for a Middle Bronze Age Exodus on the basis of archaeological data and textual data of the same kind that we're talking about. Not the same data pieces, but it feels very similar when you're going through the conversation.
Right.
So that's what we're saying.
Maggie, what was that? I've already forgotten the scholar's name, the article that I sent you about I've forgotten what the article was about.
Is that the one about the 12th century Exodus?
Yeah, it was the one that it had 12th century conquest and like a very I can't remember. I can't remember, but it pushed it much later into like a Rendsburgian.
Yeah, Rendsburg is an evangelical scholar. I think he's even.
Is this the one where the guy was arguing that Nerneta had to be the pharaoh of the Exodus?
Yeah, it's
Can
really
I show
interesting.
You guys something?
Yeah,
Can I show you guys an illustration of this problem?
And then we should probably get to super chats, but please.
Let me just show you one illustration of this problem, and then we'll go to questions, because there's some notes I was making for myself. Here's an example. So if we think that the Exodus is a real historical event, then we have to figure out who the Egyptian pharaohs mentioned in the Exodus are. And we know certain things about the pharaoh of the Exodus, one of which is that he is not succeeded by his eldest son. Why? Because the eldest son leads the army into the sea and perishes right when the Red Sea closes over him. Do you know how many pharaohs of the New Kingdom were succeeded by their eldest sons? I made a list. Right? From Second Henry Tau up to Ramses XI.
I would assume that it's common, right, for a successor to not be the oldest son.
It is the exception by far for the successor or for the successor to be the oldest son.
But I think that's pretty common. That's not just an Egyptian thing, right? Like that's an ancient world thing. Because the oldest son was usually a bit of a vulnerable position in many respects, but yeah, I mean the ancient world was rough, right?
But this is an excellent point. With other aspects or other other characteristics of these kings, of these places, of these times, right? Like we can take a postulate about the Exodus and test it against various scenarios, and you come up with something similar where this could have and again, I think this is part of the genius of the Hebrew Bible, right? The fact that so many things are these cyclical or nested or these narratives that echo, call to mind so much. But it's really frustrating because if you want the Exodus to be historical, if you want to read it historically, then you have to be willing to kind of reckon with the difficulties. So anyway, that was my point, and I'm done.
That's a great point. I'm reminded actually with that. Did you guys watch Battlestar Galactica, the new series? I call it the new series. It's like 20 years old by now. But
That's the one that's got Dumbledore Calrissian.
What? No.
The last plague, sorry, the eldest son gets taken care of by the last plague. But anyway, you see what I mean, right? He's succeeded by a son down the line.
Yeah,
sorry.
Absolutely. Yeah, I was reminded of this show because it's a reboot, right? Of this old series from the 1970s, Battlestar Galactica, and the reboot is excellent. It's one of my favorite television shows. I'm a huge sci-fi nut, but it's one of my favorite television shows. And one of the ingenious features about this reboot is that it kind of turns the core of the story into this timeless narrative that gets recycled through a variety of different eras. One of the talking points in the show is this repeated phrase, this has happened before and this will happen again. And I love that point, the point that you made about the genius of the Hebrew Bible, because I think this is very much part of the construction of this collection of texts, right?
Well, and there are other things about it too that I think people don't reckon with. Like, we tend to want to project information, and like we're talking about etymology, right? A lot of people are like ask about, like, well, what about the Apiru, right? We hear about these wandering bands from the Amarna letters, and is there any connection there with Hebrew? The fact that we're asking that question goes to show you that at the time when the text was composed, regardless of what the etymology is, regardless of whether there actually is a historical path of development from the word Apiru to our word Hebrew, the people who were writing down, composing, transmitting, however they did it, the biblical narrative, might have recognized a good pun and kept with it. Right? It's like the serpent in the Garden of Eden, right? It's a nahes, it's a copper thing, it's a metal thing. But you know, that could resonate, right, with anything from, even if it started out as an onomatopoetic, right? A serpent is a nahes because of the sound it makes. By the time you get to a period where you're talking about copper and other metals as bright and shiny things, you could be talking about things like Moses's serpent effigy, right? And other snake effigies that people would have been familiar with from the Koine of, you know, the religion of the Near East and the Bronze and the Iron Ages, all the way up to this idea of, you know, a shining thing like a fallen star that becomes that's kind of projected onto the narrative in the Hellenistic period. When you get into these kind of eschatological and you know, I don't know what the word I'm even looking for at this point is. It's getting late.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Right? Like people who were living 1,000 years, 2,000 years, 3,000 years before us were not insensible to coincidence and to pun and to things, right? To things that they could have layered narratives much the same way we do.
It's like when, you know, we were at Amara and, you know, Josh, you know, that was the
yeah, Josh. So the word in Egypt for a donkey is hamar, but in Syria apparently the word for a donkey is jahash. And again, this is one of those things. There is no real etymology here. Josh was not named after the animal. But a folk etymology developed based on an obvious resemblance that we can see, that even the little village children, it was so clear to them and they picked up on it, right? And who knows the stories they may still tell.
Awesome.
Almost certainly. Almost certainly.
Awesome.
And I'm glad that you even left in some some ambiguity there. You can just see the resemblance. It's just, is she talking about the word? Is she talking about him? I'm just kidding.
Awesome.
That was such a great
That's a perfect example of how folk etymology could develop. Coincidentally,
sure.
the two words seem to refer to the same thing on some level.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, let's get to some questions, and then I will let you guys go because you're starting to burn the midnight oil at this point. I flagged this one. This one came in early. It's from one of my patrons. She was not going to burn the midnight oil, and Ali wanted to ask about Shishak of Second Chronicles 12:9 being a shortened form of Ramses' name as proposed by David Roll in his controversial revised Egyptian timeline. Do you have any thoughts on that, Maggie, or on David Roll generally
On its
in his
face, it
controversial
sounds
timeline?
completely implausible. I can't think of any reason why that would make sense off the top of my head, but I would have to look at Roll's argument, with which I'm admittedly not familiar, before I really answered that in any depth. And I'd be happy to, and get back to you some other time.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I appreciate that. Thanks. Aram Guard for $5. Thank you for the super chat. Says, I've heard mixed opinions on the if Hapiru and Hebrew have any etymological link. Any insight from the panel? David sure makes for a good Hapiru. Actually, yeah, he kind of does.
Well,
as far as I'm aware. No, you go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to say Kyle McCarter was one of our professors at Hopkins. Apology, David.
Right.
But I'm going to turn that comment or that question over to the Semiticists here.
Yeah, I mean, Meredith Klein back in the 50s wrote 3 articles specifically on this. And I don't know that there's been a lot of development since then. Don't quote me on that because I haven't read through all the secondary literature on the etymology. The big focus was not so much on getting to etymological derivation, but how is it used in the Hebrew Bible? And I think overwhelmingly, the conclusion is when you see it in passages like Exodus 21 and Deuteronomy 15, it's synonymous with Israelites, certainly by the time you get to Deuteronomy 15. But yeah, I mean, that being said, I remember Andrew Knapp, I think he wrote quite a bit on, if I'm remembering that correctly, somebody should quote me either because it's late here as well, just as it is in Baltimore.
Same time, I think, isn't it?
Yeah, it's close anyway.
It's where it works.
Yeah. David would have fit that pattern quite well.
Yeah. So I have only to contribute. Anson Ramey in the introduction to his giant tome on the Amarna letters talks about this a little bit. I think he makes a pretty convincing case for there being no clear etymological link between the two words, and in particular with how the word Apidu functions within the Amarna letters themselves. This just seems to be largely a pejorative that just gets leveled by all the kings of Canaan against one another, and to describe the regional warlords and mercenaries who just keep coming in and attempting to loot Canaanite cities. So
right, and the Hebrew word is or the Semitic word that we think Hebrew comes from is the word across, right? Aver.
Yeah, that's.
But again,
that's where most people set it.
Depending on how you understand the origins of the Israelites, then the idea that somebody could have made that connection in the ancient world, that there could be some kind of wordplay in the Hebrew Bible on that.
That seems
wonder
really plausible, right? Yeah. Yeah,
Anyway.
I think I agree. But
My uninformed
awesome.
guess.
Thanks for the question, Aramgard. Jesus Tales for $10. The Amarna tablets reflect a late Bronze Age period. They were discovered in the last couple of centuries. When were they covered? When would they have been available to be reading in the Egyptian temple?
So this is a really interesting question, because I think, if I'm not mistaken, you might be hinting at this idea that Akhenaten is the ancestor of Israelite monotheism. And the Amarna letters, the reason we have them is basically that the city of Amarna was only occupied for a couple decades. And they are covered in the middle of the 14th century BCE. And then in principle, nobody read them for however many millennia have passed between then and their discovery. So there are a couple of things to think about here. One is that most of the Amarna letters probably also existed in a copy somewhere else. They're in Akkadian, and they're being exchanged with people in Canaan. So copies of the letter and the oral sort of memory of the messengers that carried them, right? Because these letters were not put in the post and opened by the recipient and read the way we would read a letter. They're read out loud at the court by messengers. So there are other ways for their contents to enter people's knowledge. And so the Amarna letters themselves, I'm actually not as confused about as I am the hieroglyphic texts in sort of the tombs of the, at Amarna, the royal tomb, and the tombs of the nobles. So like the great hymn to the Aten, there's so much in it that seems like what you like. So like the Psalm 104 is the classic example, right, of this idea of a solar god that, nurtures nature, and everything lives when his light touches it, and goes away at night when it's dark, right? And separation from this God is the only true punishment. How that, if that's not just a pure coincidence, then how that happens, I think, is a really interesting story to wonder about. Because again, people were still reading hieroglyphs. People could still have presumably seen these texts in hieroglyphs, in these tombs. Again, I don't 100% know the archaeological history of the tombs at Amarna to the point that I could guarantee you that people could or couldn't have had access to them who could have read them in the Iron Age. But why they would have resonated with people and whom they would have resonated with, it's a really interesting question, and one that I think, if I had a good answer to, I'd be in much better shape with publications. Although again, it's one of those big ideas that it's really hard to support and defend, and that don't make for good publications in that sense, right? Scholars don't like it when you're trying to, when you have these big vague things that it's really, it's much better to have something concrete and digestible if you're going to publish.
Yeah.
So it's fun to think about.
Exactly. It's a good lead into this other one, I think. Do you think the brief spat with monotheism with Akhenaten influenced the Hebrew Bible monotheism? I don't know if you have any thoughts
Do you guys
on
want me
that,
to start?
or Josh?
I think you're going to have to handle that one solely, Maggie.
Sure. So there are a few reasons why I don't think that it's implausible. I don't think that's a double negative. I think that it's plausible. One of which is, and again, it doesn't have to be Akhenaten. So Egyptian religion throughout the Bronze Age into the Iron Age has a syncretizing tendency. And there are texts, not from the reign of Akhenaten, but from before and after, where we hear about all gods being aspects of one God, where we hear of this idea that somehow there's a bigger truth from which this polytheistic world of many gods emanates. It's not, Akhenaten is the moment where it crystallizes into this whole, there's only one God that you're allowed to worship, and he only has a couple of aspects at most. But there is a sort of centralizing, a sort of centrifugal tendency in Egyptian theology that certainly could have been picked up by people moving back and forth between Egypt and Canaan. And, again, you have these really sort of suggestive little glimpses in the late Bronze Age of, like, the 🀭 of Yahoo, right? These famous Bedouin that interact with Egypt. Like, we see them in the inscriptions of Amenhotep III in the 14th century BCE. Where is Yahoo, and is it in any way connected with the god Yahweh? Are these, North Arabian followers of a god Yahweh who are in Egypt interacting with the Egyptians in some context, and somehow out of this grows a henotheism around Yahweh that's then incorporated somehow into the Canaanite realm, right? This idea somehow finds its way into Canaan, and people incorporate it into what becomes Israelite religion and later Judaism, right? Not impossible, but impossible to document, defend, support, given the information we have.
Yeah, no,
Because there
would,
are, admittedly, right? So these, you have these kind of. Go ahead, Kip.
no, I was just gonna say, you finish saying what you're gonna say, and then I'll say my thing, and we'll move on.
Right. There's even one Book of the Dead where there's a person who's the owner of the book might have been named something like my God is the shepherd of Yah, like my God is a god of Yah, whatever that means, in Egypt, right? But again, not an Israelite, had a Book of the Dead,
right?
Happy with Egyptian gods,
right? So I would say that all that is really interesting, and I would agree, not implausible, but I tend to, I won't get into it, but I've got thoughts and feelings about the development of monotheism that come quite a bit later and emerge out of I guess more political social ideas of this new relationship that the kingdom of Judah has to their neighbors and the surrounding world, coming out of basically the destruction of the northern kingdom following the Assyrian invasion.
And to be clear, even then it doesn't take, right? There are at least sort of dualistic concepts of God in the Hellenistic period within Judaism. We're not just talking about Israelite religion.
Absolutely. Yep.
So Kip, I want to just go ahead and go on record as saying I will defer to you on this one too.
All right. But thank you very much for the question, though, the Backyard Professor. Joshua Owens, for $5, asks, what do you think about the idea that we did get to this. I don't know if you were looking for a text, and Josh and I attempted to answer this question. I don't know if you have any thoughts about this, Maggie. This idea that the Exodus was written as a polemic against Manetho. And Joshua loves all our works.
I love this because I love Manetho and Josephus, and I love Hellenistic historiography. So it is clear that the Exodus story as we know it is not necessarily universally known and accepted, right? So the Exodus story is known, but like the progression that we have from Exodus to the Deuteronomistic history seems to still be in flux. There seem to be different ways to look at that story in the Hellenistic period, the time when Manetho is living, and later, just much later, right, a couple hundred years later, Josephus is responding to Manetho, among others, right? There was an idea that Moses founded the city of Jerusalem that seems to directly contradict the idea that David conquers the Jebusite city of Jerusalem 300 years after or more after Moses. And if you look at the stories that were circulating about Jews and sort of trying to understand them in the Hellenistic period, these early encounters with Judaism, or these early accounts of it in Hellenistic histories, you could see the Hellenistic period being a time when people would want to get their story together. And that's what Josephus is trying to do, right? He writes his history as a response to this kind of wealth of different takes on these same stories. But Josephus clearly had a pretty clear idea of the book of Exodus, right? It exists probably in something close to, the story is close to what we would know now in the Persian period. Is that fair, Kip? Because Josephus seems to pull on it, right? And Josephus seems to have, kings, or, he has the Deuteronomistic history there, those stories have congealed. So the idea that the whole thing was made up to answer Manetho, I think is probably not supportable. But the idea that it was reworked, that it was interpreted, that it was spread and developed as a kind in the context of a world people were trying to interact with and understand Judaism better is, and in some cases to attack it, I think is probably a good one.
Yeah.
Does that make sense to you guys?
I agree. Sounds good. So, David Darcy, thank you for the $5 super sticker. I flagged this one. Does anyone know how or when did the story become Red Sea instead of Sea of Reeds? I believe this first appears with the translation into Greek, and the Septuagint says Red Sea.
I think what you mean, Kip, is the translation from the Greek into Hebrew.
Fair enough. Sorry about that, Josh. You're missing out on the inside joke, Maggie, I'm afraid. But yeah, this is something that I believe first appears in the Greek text. My own personal feelings about this are that this is probably the Yam Suf is probably not necessarily the Sea of Reeds. I would actually prefer to understand this as the sea at the end. I think there's a stronger cosmic picture at work here, certainly in the earliest Exodus traditions. I don't know if you guys have anything else to say on that. You're just like your brains are just fried and you're just dying to get to bed. I can tell. So we'll plow.
I'm having fun though, as long as you guys are okay with me blanking on things like.
Pat just commented that I look high, so and I don't think he's talking about my thigh. So thanks, Pat.
So there's somebody named Tempest. Their name seems to have popped up a lot in the chat. Hi, Tempest. I don't know. I just keep seeing her names.
I think they're. Oh, okay.
Are there other questions we need to get to? I'm happy to take a.
Yeah. I'm sorry. I got distracted. Did I get? I think I missed Adam Dudziak super sticker. Thank you very much. Jesus Tales. How universal, cosmopolitan, was the late Bronze Age? I think the king of Yerushalayim in the Amarna tablets had a Sumerian name. That's Abdi Hepa, I believe, was the king of Jerusalem. Is that a Sumerian name? I didn't.
No, but
Abdi would be like my servant.
Yeah.
Oh,
okay. But the question of how universal or how cosmopolitan the world was in the late Bronze Age, I think the answer is very. There's a sort of not world, but at least a very super regional administrative language in the form of Akkadian. There's tremendous amounts of travel, trade, intellectual exchange. People are hello.
This is I had no idea you had a cat. Wow.
We have two.
Nice.
Again. I mean, I love them.
But yes, so the Akkadian language can be written in part or in whole in Sumerian logograms, absolutely. And so the Sumerian script forms the basis for the script that's used to write Akkadian. Long story, Josh is better qualified to tell than.
Yes.
I unfortunately didn't hear anything except my name.
We write in pictures. We were
sorry.
We were talking about using Sumerian logograms to write Akkadian.
Yes. You can.
But I think insofar as how cosmopolitan things were in the late Bronze Age, I mean the picture that Eric Klein paints is I actually think he might even call it the first golden age of like globalism. And around the
first peace treaty, the Treaty of Kadesh that we talked about.
The very first peace treaty, exactly. The Treaty at Kadesh. So yes, highly cosmopolitan, lots of movement and trade and traffic going on, and then everything goes to shit. So but thanks for the super chat. AT for $10. Jones claims, by way of Joshua Berman, which is a book that I haven't read yet, an early date for the Exodus because Yahweh's curses in Deuteronomy are supposedly closer to late Bronze Hittite vassal treaties than Iron Age Assyrian treaties. True or false?
I will direct you, AT, to Jake Lowenger's review of
Berman?
but it's Kitchen, and is he the other one that did the treaties, covenants, and I always forget the name of that 2-volume. I don't want to call it monstrosity because it is really useful to have all of those things in one place in translation, but translations are anyway. Yeah, yeah. I will refer you to his review of that 2-volume set to show the problems with this type of analysis.
If you could, I would also like to see that review. If you can share that at some point, Josh, that'd be great.
Jake Lowenger is, I definitely will. He is phenomenal scholar. No surprise.
Yeah. You Hopkins,
right. Well,
guys
he's
represent,
right?
right?
We can't really take credit for that because he's a Chicago guy. So when you get beaten
What
by
else do we got?
Brinkman, right?
All right. Yeah, there you go. Check out Jake Lowenger's review. Aramgard, thank you for the $5. How do we feel about identifying the Shasu of Sarar with Mount Seir in Edom? Seen mixed opinions from experts. Ted Lewis seems on board in his God book.
That is the greatest name, his God book. I'm going to start using that.
Yeah,
that is what it is. It is the God book. I'm okay with it, honestly. Right?
Yeah, it works.
Me too, actually. Yeah. So look at that. We're all agreed.
I think Edom is a toponym in the Egyptian language that people are not. It's not like Moab where there are other good explanations for it. And I think people are comfortable with the idea that Edom in the late Bronze Age is Edom as we understand it in Egyptian texts.
I would imagine that Dan Fleming, I haven't read through, I got through like the first third, maybe quarter of the book, and then had to put it down because another topic required my attention continuously for several months. But yeah, I think Dan Fleming's new book on Yahweh probably deals with this. I know Lester Graby's new book that's coming out here a couple months. I think it's in a couple months. We'll engage with it as well. Anyway.
Yeah. But yeah, no, I think, we're all agreed. It's a good connection. Claude's, I got 2 more here, guys. Claude Simeon for $5. He popped this in when you made your prosecutor analogy, Josh. Should be a monk reference.
Sorry.
Somehow.
Sorry.
That was
epic
also
fail.
a really good show.
Epic fail on my part. I always use Maggie, I always use references to the show Monk with Tony Shalhoub, and I feel like it works, and I should have done it this time, but I failed. I'm sorry, everybody. I repent.
That was also a good show. Oh, I lied. I've got 2 more. Sorry, guys. Domingo Aviles. Unfortunately, I missed lots of the talk. Did you guys address the etymology of Moses' name? And no, we did not. Do you want to say a few things about that, Maggie? I think this is
the short version is that it's a perfectly good Egyptian name. It would be short for, so Mesu means bore or begat him. So a lot of Egyptians have names that say this god. So like Amen Mosa, the god Amen is the one who begot him, bore him, or Jehudi Mesu, like the god Thoth, the scribe god. So, but it also, the sounds can make a Hebrew word, right, that becomes etymologized, right?
And go figure, they build an etymology out of it. So that's just kind of what they do. One question I do have on this point, is it unusual to see that element on its own as a name, because it's usually compounded with other things, isn't it?
It would depend on the register, I would think, or the
Okay.
context. So people, in the private individuals, be called Messi or, Mehi. They'll use hyperchristics, even in monumental inscriptions. So it wouldn't be impossible. As a royal name, if you were really trying to make a point about somebody being an Egyptian prince, you probably wouldn't just call him Prince Moses. It'd just be like, Lord John Farquhar III being Jack.
Nice. Awesome. Well, thank you, Domingo Aviles, for the super chat and for that great answer, Maggie. Our friend Pat Lowinger, or at Discovering Ancient History with Pat Lowinger, asks regarding the development of monotheism within Judaism. Does it develop in parallel with Christianity in the 4th to the 6th centuries BC or CE? Yeah, that's a good question. And it's a little late for me, but I think.
And the thing is, he knows that, right?
Yeah.
Which is why he's asking it. Thanks, Pat. Thanks.
Thanks,
We're gonna
Pat.
sit here like,
Thanks.
and he's gonna go, I know.
I'm gonna go out on a limb and say that I think it predates that. So,
But isn't that one of the
and I'm
great
just
bifurcations?
sorry.
But isn't that one of the sort of great branching offs, right? So Christianity kind of settles
The
on,
parting of the ways.
yeah, and then Judaism settles on kind of a plain text monotheism with all kinds of
Yeah.
separate sort of mystical branches that still retain so many of these ideas of emanation and
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's
hypostasis and transformation.
Don't make up words, Maggie. Come on.
I can make up words
All
too.
right. I got one more, and then I'm gonna let you guys go.
Yep.
Because you've been like super champs. Jim Foy, thank you for the $2. When was the holiday Yom Kippur Davis invented? Just now, I think, and I'm not sure what day Yom Kippur Davis would be, but probably a day when I can watch a hockey game in 4K. It's always a good day. So
I think it's the
don't
third
know.
month on the second Tuesday of the week.
Sounds good. Works for me.
Indeed,
Thanks
a lot.
everyone for your questions. Thanks for coming and hanging out. Thank you, Maggie, for hanging out with us and walking through some of these issues with a stronger sense of nuance and clarity. Really appreciate it. Do you want to say some things as we wrap up here on what you're doing and where people can find you if you want to be found? Maybe you don't. Maybe you just want to disappear. I don't know, but
Every now and then somebody will reach out to me and ask to talk about ancient Egypt. And the thing is, I love doing it. It's fun. I enjoy talking with people about the ancient world. And you guys are really smart, and I enjoy talking with you guys. I enjoy hearing what kind of questions your viewers put forward. So I'm always happy to chat with y'all and just But I hope it was worth y'all's time, and thanks for a fun way to spend the evening.
yeah,
It's great.
absolutely. Anything going on, Josh?
Sleep.
Oh, sleep. Yes.
I just finished chapter 15. I'm into 16 of the Leviticus commentary, at least on
Jesus.
my analysis.
Oh,
of
on
it.
your first, right? You're
Well, this
working
will be
on.
my 5th pass through, I think. So
Are you doing syntax? in grammar
No,
right
this
now, or are
is
you?
this is actually
Way
doing.
beyond that. Oh wow.
I'm doing everything without looking at any commentaries. I'm just trying to write it like as if I were publishing a commentary.
Brilliant.
The first Leviticus commentary out there. So
That's awesome. I only wish I could write as fast as you. It's wild.
you don't have a
So
psychosis. So that's the issue.
Speaking of things like that, I've got to run. I have a 4-year-old
Okay.
that's still awake. And
Yep. Oh God. Yeah. You need to go. So thanks again. Please come back at some point. And yeah, really appreciate it. So I'm just gonna hit I'm just gonna take us out here. I'm gonna hit
in the meantime, y'all take care.
everyone. Yeah, you too.
It was
All
great
right.
to see you.
Good night, everyone. Thanks.